Hello and welcome. I'm Josh. This is the Glen Ellen Public Library webinar on college writing. Um, Today I have with me Cameron Harrow from College Nanny Sitters and Tutors
Hi.
in organization Wheaton. He is the Writing Center Manager and he does writing, tutoring, and coaching. And this was also his job at Wheaton College. Um, I invite all of you attendees, everybody watching, to put your questions or your comments in the chat. I will be monitoring them and I will throw them at Cameron as they come up. If it's most convenient to what he's talking about, or hold them to the end. So that's the best way that you can get your voice here on this webinar. And this will also be available on the Glen Ellen Public Library social media platforms. So you'll be able to go back and rewatch this again. With that, go ahead and take it away, Cameron.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. Hi, everyone. I can't see you. Hopefully, you can see me. As Josh said, I am working at College Nanny Sitters and Tutors in Wheaton. I'm actually the Learning Center Manager, so we don't only do writing, we do many other things as well. And yeah, we'll just go right into it. So I'm going to share my screen here. Oh,
yeah. I may need to
it
do
says
that.
hosted.
Yeah.
Can you let me share
Yep.
screen?
You
I'm going to keep
got it.
talking.
Yeah.
So one of the things about this presentation is necessarily going to be that it is kind of general. I'm going to give you some tips, some outlines, ways to approach the writing process, but that can never get at the particularity of your own story, your own writing. And so I really recommend that you also seek out help, whether that's from a company like mine or from friends, family, things like that. So this this presentation is in roughly two parts. The first part is kind of how to write any paper, like a very general process. And that'll be approaching it from the broad level, saying like, here are the steps, these are what they are. This is how to approach the writing process. And then we'll get a little bit more specific about each of those steps, and we will do some comparing and contrasting not only the college application paper, but also some more academic papers that you might be writing once you get into college. Yeah, so just keep that structure in mind. We'll get to the specifics about writing application papers a bit later on in the presentation. So with that out of the way, let's get right into it. But only if I can advance my PowerPoint. There we go. All right, so I've divided up the whole writing process into 5 steps. The first is to address your genre. That's what am I writing and to who? There are a lot of different genres of papers. There are a lot of different genres of writing. I mean, paper itself is a genre. Poetry is a genre. The blog post is a genre. A letter is a genre. And so the conventions that cover all of the different kinds of writing are going to be very important for you to figure out early on in the writing process, before you go on to anything, like a draft even. After you have a better sense of what your genre is going to look like, you want to move on to research and your thesis. This is sort of assembling the building blocks of what you're going to do in your paper or your writing. I said it's what should I tell my audience? You're going to seek different sources. You're going to do different ways of cataloging that information, organizing it into something that you want your audience to know. After you do your research and figure out what your thesis is, you do an outline and a rough draft. And that's where you're trying to ask yourself, does my writing work? I have this idea of what I'm writing and what its purpose is and to who I'm writing it. And I kind of know like what I want to tell them. This is where you start to get into the nitty gritty and you say, okay, like, Does this idea fit with this idea? We'll get more into it later. After that, you have to do revisions. It's how can it be better? Revisions are things that you do alone, but they're also things that you bring others in. This point is where you would bring it into a friend, a family member, a teacher, and they'll help you see things that you couldn't see by your own, and they'll help you make your writing better. And then finally, you get to the final draft and you say, how can I make this writing perfect? How can it be as good as it can be? And so if you see, the way I've constructed this graphic shows that these things that they build up to each other. It really matters that you're really solid in the earlier parts so that you don't get to the later parts and find that your writing really doesn't work, or you've misunderstood the purpose of your writing, and you have to go all the way back through and undo kind of all your work and put it back together again. The more work you can put in at earlier stages, the easier everything will go. And so there are some common pitfalls. And this one is perhaps the most obvious one. It's the one that all of us have to be trained out of. It's where we're so focused on getting that final draft out the door that we kind of approach everything with that in mind. And we say, all right, but how can I make this, how can I get this out the door tomorrow at 12 p.m. or something? And you really skimp on the lower parts. And sometimes it works a little bit, sometimes it really doesn't work, but it will always be better if you spend more time earlier. This next pitfall, though, this is how I actually wrote most of my papers in college, where I had a good sense of the genre, of who I was writing to and why, and what I wanted to accomplish. And I had done really good research. But then I would just try to go right away and write out in one draft exactly what I wanted to say. And that caused me a lot of grief, just because I would find that things didn't work. I didn't do the outline in rough draft, and I would just try to do everything perfectly the first time. That's just not how it works. So I really recommend that you go ahead and do all of the steps. If you leave this presentation with nothing else, just remember that writing is a full process, and skipping steps will just make everything more painful.
Yeah, I can say from my own experience in college, that second, I needed to write the final draft instantly, and I needed to have every sentence perfect, and I didn't spend time thinking about it. I didn't spend time thinking, does this fit together, or am I saying something new?
Yeah, I would try to carry all of the things in my head, instead of using different tools to get things on paper where I can see them. And it seems like the distance between your head and your keyboard isn't very far, but sometimes it turns out to be so. If you try to do the second one, you may end up with some crazy stories about writing a 12-page paper in 6 hours, starting at midnight. I've had that. I mean, it makes a good story, but it's not something you want to do too often. So I recommend doing the whole process. So let's get a little bit more into the nitty-gritty of all the different steps and how they might be different for different kinds of papers. So let's start off with genre. I've said small mistakes early on make a big difference at the end, so it's really important to get genre right. Imagine shooting a bow and arrow or something. A very small difference in where you're aiming makes a really big difference when you get down the line. And so you have to be really precise here. Often we do genre in a way almost unconsciously. Well, of course I know what I'm doing and who I'm writing it to. I'm writing a 10-page paper for my teacher. Why should I think any more about that? Well, there are things that it would be really helpful to bring into your mind, such as, what is the purpose of this paper? What do I want my writing to accomplish rhetorically? And I've given some examples there. There's the persuasive paper, you take an issue and you argue one side of it. There's exposition. A lot of papers in the natural sciences kind of do a review of what other people have said. It's just volunteering information that we're thinking is true. There's also drama. If you're writing a short story, or even a certain kind of college application essay, You might want to really get at your reader's heartstrings and tug them along. There are all of these different reasons that you're writing and that your reader will be reading that it's really important to get a hold of at the beginning. Think about poetry. What sort of different purposes might you be bringing to your paper? Next is the parameters. What are the boundaries within which I'm writing? These are kind of the ones that show up in whatever prompt you're using. Word count, a source requirement. Do I have to use this many anecdotes, this many academic journals, this many newspaper articles, etc.? Do I have to use MLA style, APA style, Chicago style? Are there any requirements on how long my paper has to be or how complex its structure has to be? These are sort of the concrete nuts and bolts things. Hopefully for college application papers, most of those are given to you. They might be a little weird though. And finally, for genre, I've given what's the context? What community am I writing to? And what is my place in it? You know, even if you're writing a journal entry just to yourself, that's a particular community. You're writing it for yourself. If you're writing a letter, you're writing it for one other person. If you're writing for a newspaper, you're writing for as many people as will read. The context is really important because it brings in a lot of aspects of your tone. Is this an intimate community? Is this one where I'm very familiar with my audience? Is it one where I really don't know anyone and I have to introduce everything because I can't assume any familiarity? Is it a new community? Is it an old community? Am I new to it? What are the relationships of authority here? Who is going to be judging my writing and on what grounds, for what purpose? Those things will really affect your tone and your style and how you present yourself. So let's get a little bit into this. So for the application paper, the purpose of the paper really is to showcase parts of your story or personality that supplement or complete what you're presenting in your application. It's really not a place at all to kind of list your achievements or to give things that you've given in other parts of your application. What they're looking for in a college application paper is things that they wouldn't easily know just by looking at the sort of, well, these are my grades, these are the activities that I've done. It's a place for you to show off things that are uniquely yours, whether they're personality things or experiences that have really formed you. How should your character make the committee want you to be at that school? The parameters, I've given the 250 to 650 word parameter, which is the college app personal essay, the Common App personal essay, but there are a lot of other possible requirements. I remember when I was applying, a lot of my friends applied to Stanford, and there was actually one question where they were allowed 6 words. And I forget what the exact prompt was, but I remember that being really striking as a way of kind of boiling down my own like particular personality into a really pithy phrase. But so I've put there also, other than like the word count, it's actually pretty free, the parameters are. There are all sorts of different prompts that you'll encounter. I mean, there are obviously the 7 Common App ones for the personal essay, but each school will have its own different prompt and what it wants from you. And it also depends on what sort of program you're applying for. Certain schools would be looking for a real demonstration of like your English competency or your scientific acumen or whatever. The parameters are going to be just as specific to the college as your paper is going to be to you. And then the context is a competitive evaluation by the admissions committee at these different schools. So your evaluators are going to be reading your papers, and they're going to be reading them alongside other students' papers. And they're going to be trying to say, well, all of these people have asked to be admitted to our school. Who fits our culture the best? What sort of student do we want the most? And so, obviously for the Common App one, you're applying to a bunch of different schools. So you should probably just present what is most authentically you. But it would also really help if you're applying to a specific school and they want a different essay, to gain as much knowledge as you can about their culture, all of these things, so that you can highlight parts of yourself, not make something up, not be dishonest, but you can frame how you present yourself for your different audiences. I think that's really important.
That's kind of part of the research, it sounds like, is important.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Now let's talk a bit more about the academic paper. And so the purpose is to demonstrate mastery of the subject material, whether that's science or history or English, or I was a philosophy student, some obscure philosopher from the last 2,000 years, especially through compelling arguments. It's all about argument and supporting the thesis. So it's less about display and more about building a case. The parameters for an academic paper, they'll vary some depending on the class, depending on the professor. But something was pretty standard for my schooling was between 3,000 and 4,000 words, which usually comes out to about 10 to 15 pages. The different numbers and kinds of sources are often specified. Again, journal articles are huge. Books, academic books are important. But those are often given to you. The style is often specified, things like that. So even though it's like a lot longer and it seems like a lot more, it can actually be helpful compared to the application paper because they give you more of a guide as to what they want. It can be harder to write creatively and strongly in a sort of free environment. And in the context of the academic paper is you're writing primarily to your professor, or if you're writing an article for a journal or some other publication, other participants in your field, other students, other readers. And they're not going to be evaluating you directly against other people in the sense of competition. They're not saying, okay, like, do we want this one to like be right or this one to be right? You're just competing to be right, to say something convincing enough that you convince the rest of your discourse community that you have something worth saying.
That sounds like a really good challenge, to be able to be persuasive while not necessarily having yourself personally convinced by the persuasion.
Yeah, that sometimes happens. Hopefully you're persuaded by what you're saying. But it's a good practice to try to argue things that you don't always agree with. It makes you be more rigorous sometimes. Well, let's move on to research and the thesis. Research and thesis, you say? What do you mean? I'm doing a paper about myself. Well, I recommend that you actually do think about maybe doing some research. Often we start with this opinion or this answer that we have, and then we try to justify it. We try to say why everyone else should think that too. And I think that a better way to go about writing papers, whether you're writing an application paper or an academic paper, is to start with a question and then try to answer it. So I recommend for research that you find sources that are credible in your genre, credible in your context. Well, you know, for a scientific paper or something like that, maybe only like other journal articles are acceptable. If you're writing a philosophy paper, maybe you can advance your own argument, just saying, hey, as I've been reflecting on this, this is what seems convincing and these are the reasons. And if you can back it up, that's good enough. It's important that you use different kinds of sources in different kinds of paper so that you're not just doing like kind of in one alley, so that your readers don't say, oh, have they considered this other thing as well? I've given tertiary, secondary, and primary there because that's kind of a common way of breaking it down. One way to think about viewing that is that tertiary sources are kind of like looking at things from like the Google Maps distance. They'll give you like a really good overlay of the whole context of the issue that you're researching with your question. Secondary is maybe more like looking from a high place, like the top of a hill. You're not quite to where you can see everything, but you can get a better sense of the lay of the land. And then primary sources are like, they're like tweets. They're like right in front of the thing that you're looking at. So they don't have really good context, but they could have really good descriptions of individual details. So yeah, different kinds of sources are important. While you're using different sources to answer your question, I recommend that you use tools to keep track of what you've learned and begin building a body of writing. One of my favorite tools is called an annotated bibliography. And what that is that you take your source and you like write down what the source is. And then after you've read the article or read the book or done an interview with a different person, you write down a paragraph saying what the source said, essentially. You do a paragraph summary or an abstract of that source, and then you do another paragraph saying, this is how it might link to my other sources or to my question, or to what I hope my thesis will be. Again, that's an annotated bibliography. It's one of the sources that I've found most helpful. And then the last thing I've said for research is that you want to continually be refining your question. Maybe as you're starting your question, you realize, wow, my question's actually super broad. I'm getting too many different sources, and I can't get clarity on this one thing. Maybe I have to narrow my research question. I have to get more specific about what I'm asking. Alternatively, you might say, wow, I'm really not turning up any sources about my topic. Maybe I don't have enough information to write a paper. Maybe I have to broaden my question. However, once you've amassed a certain number of resources, you can move on to thinking about your thesis. Similarly to how you have to adjust your research question, your thesis has to fit the assignment, both in its scope and its content. One of the things that I see most often with people, both writing academic and application papers, is that they try to do too much in too small of a space. They haven't taken a small enough piece to chew. They've bit off more than they can chew. The second thing about your thesis is that it has to be determined by the research. That's kind of restating what I said there on the left, that it's more important that you answer your question than that you justify your opinion. You can only argue what you have support for. And so if you don't have support for something, don't try to argue it. Again, your support can be, your own intuition or reasoning, but if you can't justify it, you probably can't argue it.
I have a question. I have a question about that. So sometimes if you have, what if you're trying to argue from a point about there should be more information because it seems that there would be. So right now we're seeing things like Hidden Figures, where we see there was a group of Black computer scientists who have been ignored by history, by the sources. If you look at computer science with NASA, is there a way that would that ever come up in how you're tweaking your thesis? If you're it seems like there should be something here, but I can't find anything.
Yeah, that's a very interesting thing to bring up. What if there's a gap in the record? Well, I guess one of the things that I'm assuming about this approach is that if you're writing certainly a college application paper, but probably even most academic papers that you would write in college, you're not the one doing the research. You're not, or the first scale research. Most of what we do, honestly, in college is we do summaries. We may contribute new arguments, but sort of going out into the primary sources is not the first thing that most college students are doing. Some get to it when they're seniors and things. But I would suspect, even in the case where you thought there ought to be something where there wasn't, you would have some sort of reason. You would either have data, or you would have heard anecdotes, or there would kind of be alternative sources. And so you would have something to say, hey, like, because of these different sources, like I think there should be something here, but there isn't. The way I'm thinking about framing it right now, Josh, is that there were probably primary sources talking about the hidden figures, historical data. Generally, most college students work within the secondary sources, people who are writing about history, people who are kind of doing the summary work already. But getting into the weeds of those primary resources is really important, even though it's not as efficient as doing the summaries. Was that clear enough? I feel like that meandered a little bit. You still have any questions about that?
The meandering, I feel, is part of that process, because maybe you'd go and you talk with your professor about, hey, I'm doing this or that, and it feels like something's missing. Should I dig into this? Do you have any suggestions? Getting that, making sure that you fit the assignment and fit the time frame, as well as maybe making a note. Maybe this is something that I do on my own later.
Yeah, for sure. One of the really helpful things, especially when you're doing like an academic paper, maybe less so in an application paper, is that you can go as a student to a reference librarian, someone who has subject expertise who's not your professor, and you can say, hey, I've been doing this research and I have this question about the research that I've been doing. Can you help me? I've found that even though I think I'm very competent with, reference library systems and search engines and stuff, the people who actually spend the time in the library know a lot more than I do. So yeah, you can look for assistance in more places than just revision, and this would be a place to do it. All right. So the third thing I said about the thesis was that it should be contestable. It should be something that someone could reasonably disagree with. Now, this is itself a controversial bullet point, maybe, because there are different genres of papers. As I said, there are papers, maybe scientific summary papers especially, where most of the paper is just saying, hey, these researchers in this time said this. These researchers in this time said this. You're probably not going to have a lot of people like disagreeing with you about that. But most papers that have like theses that are grounded in a controversial piece of evidence, like a book or a novel or historical events, there's stuff there to disagree with that people do disagree with about. Maybe a helpful way to think about this is that if it's not contestable, your thesis might not be narrow enough. You might still kind of be at a summary level. And so you need to get into something that is still unsettled enough to be worth talking about. And sometimes that requires getting more into the weeds.
It sounds similar to kind of the scientific method, where your hypothesis needs to also be disprovable.
Yeah, fair.
To a certain degree.
Yeah, that sounds perfectly reasonable. And the last thing I said about the thesis was it's the cornerstone of the paper. If it doesn't work, the paper won't work. The way I always talk about it when I'm doing paper help is your introduction, its only job is to catch everyone who's coming in from their like specific walks of life and deliver them all together to the thesis, the bottom of the funnel. And then every part of the main body of your paper is involved in defending the thesis, supporting the thesis, establishing it, clarifying it, qualifying it, doing all of these things around this central statement, what you want your audience to believe or know or be convinced about. And then your conclusion kind of as the opposite of the introduction, goes from the thesis and spreads out back into a sort of application to say, all right, now that you've learned this, these are some of the implications. These are how you, my readers, can return to your ordinary lives in light of this fact. So yeah, thesis is super important. But remember, you want to start with a question and answer it. It's always better that way. All right, let's move on to a bit of more specific contrasting. So for the application paper, the question is typically given by the prompt. I've just given one of the college or the Common App personal prompts, which is reflect on a time when you questioned or challenged a belief or idea. What prompted your thinking? What was the outcome? So they've been really helpful in that they've provided your question for you. And here is maybe what we were talking about earlier, how I'm writing a paper about me. Like, what do you mean I have to do research? Well, it can be really helpful so that you can get some writing down before you get to writing a draft. Think about writing down some anecdotes, some stories from your life. Do some personal reflecting, maybe some journaling. I think this could be really helpful. Even interview your friends and your family saying, hey, do you remember this time where I questioned or challenged this? What did you see in that? What can you tell me from the outside that I might not be able to see? So yeah, I really do recommend using tools and taking research in the application paper seriously. And as for the thesis of the application paper, it's kind of broad. It's like, well, when I challenged that thing, it made me into a person who's better suited to your university or something. It's not super specific. It's I fit you. But it's also kind of limited by the length of the paper. So it's kind of broad, but it doesn't have a ton of depth. We'll address that a bit more when we get to the outline. And then again, the controversial part of the thesis is comes when the evaluators say, well, did this experience really make this person a person who really sits my university? Or is it actually the case that another person is better suited? And let's talk a little bit also about the academic paper. One thing about academic papers is that the questions are definitely not as directly questions as they are in the application paper. It's more, go write a 12-page research paper on this like field. Pick a topic. And so it's on you to decide what your question is going to be, what interests you, and to pursue all of that through the research yourself. Again, you can totally seek help, but you're going to get less guidance in asking the question than you would in an application paper. And there I've listed just a few possible sources that are useful. Academic articles, which you can find in databanks like JSTOR or EBSCO or all sorts of things. And then books, interviews. I mean, it depends on your topic. The sorts of sources that you're going to use in a philosophy paper are going to be very different from the sorts of papers or sources that you're going to use in a communications something. Yeah. And so as for the thesis in an academic paper, the scope could be very focused, like, some super nitty-gritty detail of this very obscure field. But because the depth of your inquiry is going to be so deep, the thesis can also just entail a lot of writing. So where the application is kind of broad and maybe shallow, like you can't do that much in 600 words, a thesis in an academic paper is going to be pretty focused, pretty narrow, very, very, very deep. And as I said a bit before, the controversy comes from the people who read your paper either saying, that seems reasonable to me, or that seems really unreasonable to me. So again, you're submitting something for evaluation against what everyone else thinks to be the truth. Tasks are different. They're both difficult in their own ways, but you can do them because you've done the research. Let's move on to the outline and the rough draft. As I said earlier, this is where you find out if your writing works. Think like very nuts and bolts here. You're not going through stuff with a fine-tooth comb yet. let's talk about the outline first. This might actually be my favorite part of the writing process. I love figuring out how the parts of the paper are related to the whole and to each other. So like the ideas matter. The full sentences don't. Like you can put in bullet points, you can do phrases, you can do things that like only you could interpret because you're the only one who needs to. But you need to figure out how everything links together. If maybe something else should belong here. I do a lot of like, copy paste, like moving whole blocks like after different parts of the argument. I found that the key is often in transition words. I have this idea. Despite that, other people might say this. However, for other reasons, I still support my thesis. Using those key hinge words to figure out how the different parts are related to each other is really key here in the outline. Yeah, and yeah, as I said before, it should look like pared down proofs almost. I said geometrical. My first thought was logical because I did philosophy. The point is, it should look almost symbolic. It's not about the language specifically. As I said there, I don't think I said this earlier, you can put like the location of your important sources like in the outline and not copy paste them in. Just say, hey, in my annotated bibliography, page 15, I have this quote from this really important source. So yeah, it's all about getting the nuts and bolts like working out together. The next part is the rough draft. As I say, the only task is to put flesh on the outline. Think of the outline as a skeleton. Maybe the rough draft then is the muscle, and we don't have skin yet. It's important to get everything in complete sentences, but the specific style doesn't. Maybe your specific voice or your tone or making sure you're varying your sentence structure. Those are issues that you don't have to get at here. Rough drafts are pretty hard for me personally. I always really wanted to get the language right the first time. I would get bogged down in the details when I think as I say in the last point, it's way easier to revise a mediocre paper into a good one than it is to write a good one in one draft. Speed is really key. And so it's not worth it at this point in the paper to get bogged down in specific phrasings and making sure the whole paragraph like sounds really good when you read it aloud. It's important to get the muscles on the bone. And so one thing I said there is, if you get stuck, it's a question to ask yourself. Do I need to do more research, a different thesis? Do I need to change things around in my outline or in my organization? This is where the problems should come up in a big way, and then you can flag them and go back and fix them in the other steps of the paper. It's important to do this now because later when you are revising and getting on to the final draft, it's like putting skin on the paper. Then moving things around gets harder. You have to work really on making sure the language matches up and making sure all the references work. So this is a really important part. And as I said in the pitfalls early on in the presentation, this is the one that I often skipped. So I recommend not skipping it. It's really good to get a good, bad, rough draft out there. Good because it's done, bad because it's not perfect, but that's okay.
And you'll probably have heard of professors either saying to their students or to other people, like, I feel you gave me a rough draft. Like,
yeah. If this had had just a little bit more revision, it could have been an A+ paper. Well, that's why you should do some revisions. So for an application paper, I've said that the rough draft is more important than the outline. So that's because the length and the sort of simplicity of the structure make it easier to adjust mid-writing. You can say, okay, well, maybe this paragraph like belongs in a different place, but I only have like 5 paragraphs. So that doesn't throw me off too hard. You can kind of radically readjust the purpose of the paper more easily in this context. And so it's more important to get everything down in sentences, and you can move it around that way. It's just important to get it done. Let's say the structure is fairly simple, streamlined. In that case, though, because you don't have very many words, and because your argument and your things are going to be fairly simple, it's important to maximize the effect of your writing. You don't have as much space to convince them that you're like the right candidate, so you really have to work on, just making sure that everything is as tight and cohesive as possible. So yeah, I say always ask if this part works with the whole. That's the rule for all outline and rough draft. How do the parts work together? How do they work with the whole? But generally, you're going to be doing that more on the paragraph level, on the sentence level. How does this sentence relate to the topic sentence of this paragraph? Not how do these 3 paragraphs relate to my first body paragraph in section 1A and stuff. So you can afford to spend more time on the nitty-gritty in an application paper. That's really not the case, though, in an academic paper. Here, the outline is way more important than the rough draft, because you really don't want to be trying to do a revision of your structure when you're knee-deep in a 15-page paper. It really requires the abstraction of the outline to make big adjustments. And so I would say spend a lot more time in the outline than maybe you would have for shorter papers. That'll make everything easier when you get to the rough draft and the final draft. As I said, the structure can be very complex. You can have multiple arguments for your position, and then each one might have multiple counter arguments. You have to incorporate all sorts of different sources that are either related very closely to your topic or only tangentially. You have to make all of these very careful distinctions. And so more than maximizing the effect of every sentence, of course, you want to have really good writing that is very effective on the sentence level. But more important than that is working on the structure and working on the whole flow of thought to maximize intelligibility, so that over the course of your whole very long paper, other people can track your train of thought all the way through from beginning to end, and they can reasonably ask themselves, okay, how is this part related to the thesis? Is it responding to a counter argument to the first argument? All of these things. You want to make it as understandable as possible. And as I said, it's really important to work with sections and paragraphs here. The sentences can get worked out later. Next, after you have your rough draft, is revision. Everyone's favorite part. This always takes time, and it always benefits from other eyes. You never, ever want to be revising your paper at 2 a.m. after you've had a big, long day, and you started your rough draft at 8 p.m. It just never goes well. We wish it would go faster, but it doesn't. So as I said here, I recommend giving at least a day between your writing and your revising. When you come back to your writing after a bit of a break, you'll find that actually you do have some better understanding than you did when you were writing it the first time. You see some things clearer. You say, oh, why did I say that when this is clearly so much better? That time is really important. In the revisions, you're still focused on some organizational and functional issues. This doesn't really sit right. Would this be better over here? How can I make this sentence or this paragraph more powerful? So you're still evaluating those sort of outline and rough draft topics. However, you're also starting to turn into final draft territory. So I say correct and improve the style stuff as it comes. When you see it, yeah, totally take care of it. But don't worry about making it perfect yet, because you're not set. This last one though, about reading and revising other people's work, is something that I really wish I had done when I was applying to colleges. Because I was just kind of off on myself, feeling sad about everything, and applying to schools is hard. And I didn't have anyone to support me, and I wasn't bouncing my ideas off of anyone else. So I recommend finding some friends, scheduling some time, either virtually or together, to go through and evaluate each other and correct each other and give each other ideas, but also to encourage each other. We all need friends when we're going through a hard time like college apps. So I recommend finding some. That's what I talk about here some. So it can feel like pretty uncomfortable or vulnerable to share your writing with someone, especially writing that's as personal as a college application paper. I'm exposing my whole self. It requires some courage on your part, but you can also find people who you trust to give you some good, honest feedback. I recommend finding some multiple different kinds of people to read your paper. Not only friends, not only teachers, but also parents or other mentors. You could also ask, like, you could even email the admissions people and see, like, hey, I have this paper. Would you mind like reading it over and giving me your thoughts? That would be pretty brave. I don't know if I could do that, but maybe you could do that. And then one thing that's really helpful is that you can give your reviewers guidance on what sort of things you're looking for. Are you really focused on how the language fits together? Are you really focused on how the organization is? Is my thesis compelling? Having a specific question to evaluate your paper with can be really helpful for those reviewers. And then finally, just remember that this paper isn't your final product, and all of the feedback that's going to be given to you is going to not only make your paper better, but it's intended to make your paper better. So everyone is rooting for you. Now let's do a quick compare and contrast. As I said, for the application paper, most of your reviewers are going to be people like parents and guardians or people that you trust. The important thing, though, is that they know you. You're the subject of this paper. That's the genre. They need to know your strengths, your weaknesses, some of your successes, maybe your failures and challenges, and they need to know the application process and what it means to put your best foot forward. The things that I recommend that you really focus on for revising your application paper is efficient use of space. As I said earlier, the requirements for the paper are often pretty short. Common App is 250 to 650 words. It's important to cut really lengthy descriptions and really emphasize like the analysis and the consequence and how the experience or the things that you're writing about shaped you as a person. It's important to be punchy here and not be long-winded. To that effect, it's important to use powerful expression. Use language that really, like, I don't know, lifts a lot of weight. You can't afford to use extra words. One of my mentors in college told me, every extra word wounds your reader. It makes it less likely that they'll like you by the end. So it's really important to get as efficient as possible so that you don't wound your reader. And then the last question that I put on there was, how could your paper more directly address the prompt? Because it's a shorter paper, you can do adjustments kind of later on. So it's important to not only give your reviewer the paper itself, but also give them the context. Hey, this is the extra paper that I'm writing for Northwestern, and this is the prompt, and these are the things that I was thinking of writing about, but I wrote about these things instead. Can you help me think about ways in which I might better adapt my paper to the school and the prompt? This is fairly different, all of this, from the academic paper, because most of the only people who are going to be reviewing this paper are going to be people who are really competent in the subject matter. So your professor, other students at your level, maybe students writing the same assignment, you could exchange papers. That'd be a good thing to do. Maybe another mentor in the same department or something like that. But it's going to be a bit more restricted. It's going to be a smaller audience, a more maybe rarefied audience. And then the things to really look out for are the clarity and persuasiveness of your argument. As I said before, it's really about making sure that you're as intelligible as possible throughout the whole paper, which is really difficult to do. One thing that can be really helpful for other people who are competent in your field is to look out for possible weak points or counter arguments. I've often had professors come to me and say, well, had you considered this? Maybe read this source and see what they have to say about your paper or about your topic, and then come back to me and we'll see how it all relates together. it's really important to get other perspectives because, especially as a student, you're trying to become competent, but this is also where you're trying to prove that you're competent. You're not there yet. So getting help is really important. And then the question is, how could your paper more clearly support your thesis? Does your thesis need to change at all? This is kind of the last step. This is the check. Does it work? This is the last place where you want to be going back and changing your research, your thesis, your outline, your rough draft. It's kind of like doing due diligence before you start your final draft. Great, so let's get on to the final draft. This is it. When you arrive at the final draft, you should know that your writing works and that this is the place where it's time to make it perfect. It's time to clean up the language and just sharpen everything. And so, most often when people think of revisions, they think of fixing errors. As is clear, hopefully, from the rest of this presentation, that's not what I think revision is, all of it, but it is important to do. And as I say here, reading aloud is really your best tool to catch mistakes. Even if you've written like 3,000 to 4,000 words, it's important to find like 30 minutes or more and just sit down and read the whole thing aloud. It's amazing how many little spelling errors, repeated words, missing words, even like ways that you phrase sentences. Things jump out at you when you read it aloud that it's just like, what? Like that's wrong. How is that in there? How did that make it through all my revisions? I don't know, but it's still there. And so by reading it aloud, you catch it. Really your best tool. It makes you focus on every word as it comes. The next thing is kind of tweaking the technical aspects. When I was writing papers, I would often start off with the technical aspects because it was a way to delay actually starting the work of writing the paper. But you need to be really familiar with your style, with your MLA, your Chicago Turabian, your APA. Get familiar with the style guide and get all the formatting, the margins, the page numbers, the citations especially. Those change really widely from different styles. And so getting all of that really like locked and squared away it always takes longer than you hope it will. And so I recommend really budgeting some time in for it. But it's also not super hard. By this time, you've arrived at almost the end of your paper. So it should just be like really chill, you're locked in with a cup of coffee, just, doing Chicago stuff. Should work, no problem. And then the last part, the final draft, is making your language beautiful. Now that you know all of the bones, all the muscles work together, it's time to put the skin on it. You can bring all of your skill as a writer to bear on this. And you can afford to spend time saying, is this the best word? I was trying to think of an example, but I didn't come up with one just now. Is this the best word or is another one better? What does the connotation of this word imply? Could someone take issue with using this word instead of this word? This is all about precision. And now that you know that all of your sentences and paragraphs work together, you can get into it and say, all right, I'm not going to be upset by any major changes from here on. I can afford to make everything exactly as I want to. You want to be arriving at your final draft comfortable and secure in the knowledge that your paper works. Because then you just have the nice job of making everything better. And then let's take a look at this. So one of the things about the application paper is that generally most of the thing that matters is just your words. A lot of the things, especially on the Common App, you're just copy pasting a block of text into the little Word box in the online portal. You're not like doing a PDF or anything, so you don't have to worry about all the specific this and this margin, this sort of page number. And so you can afford to focus on just how the words communicate themselves. It's really important to seek mastery of your tone too, which is sort of your attitude as the author toward the subject matter. It should really match your personality. One of the great things about college application paper is that there's really no right way to do it. Your right way to do it is just determined by who you are and what you have to bring. But so how you present that really matters, because you're not talking sort of about this this third object that both you and the reviewers are looking at. You're just talking about yourself. So you should have the tone towards yourself that fits, whether that's really formal or really like logical, regimented, or very informal, very free, very creative. There is no perfect candidate. There are many right candidates. The only thing that you can do wrong here is underemphasizing what you have to bring. And then the last thing about the application paper is that it's all about emphasizing the efficiency and power of your expression. As I said, every unnecessary word slows your reader down, lowers your chances. And so it's all about making the language as effective as possible. This is different from the academic paper in like almost every way. There can be a lot of different style requirements. I had the misfortune of writing in several different departments in college, so I had to memorize all of these different rules. But like part of that's just part of the responsibility of writing a paper in a discipline. You have to learn what the genre dictates for your final draft. And rather than seeking like, of course you want to have like a control of your tone, but the more important thing for an academic paper is being really careful and really clear. It's important to spell things out. Never assume that things that are obvious to you are obvious to your reader. It's really important to be really careful in crafting your argument, crafting your paper, so that not only your professor can understand it, but also other readers. And even your professor shouldn't be guessing, saying, I think they're saying this, but I'm not really confident. And then finally, seek to be thorough. It's better to overemphasize something, even repeat it, than to leave it out. You don't want to fluff up a paper to get the word count, of course. But it's better to err on the side of certainty that you've said what you need to say than on the side of, well, they'll probably get it. That's more what you want to do for the application paper. So I've just put a lot for you guys. And like, this takes a long time. Like, a really long time. Like weeks. It's really important to plan it out from the start, to say, all right, I'm at the bottom of the pyramid. I'm looking up. How am I going to get there? It may feel like you're kind of Sisyphus pushing the boulder up the hill, saying like, oh man, I'll never get there. Like there are too many steps. But honestly, this is way better than this. The thing about writing is it's kind of like hiking a mountain. Like the only thing you can do is take the step right in front of you. So I really recommend you start at the beginning. You start with genre, then you move into research and thesis, then you move into outline and rough draft, then you do your revisions, then you do your final draft. And at each step, you'll know what is required of you. You'll know that you have to do this next thing in order to progress on your paper. You're not kind of lost in the void trying to like haul yourself up by starting a final draft the day it's due. The process works. It's hard to start the process sometimes because you see how far you have to go. But trust me, everything will be easier for you if you do it this way. This is how I wish I had done all my papers.
Great.
And that's all I have.
Yes, good.
I'm tutoring a girl for her college application paper like tomorrow. So you can come reach out to me too. But also you can reach out to people at the library, to friends and family. The important thing is that you get some friends alongside you and you manage this process as best as you can.
That's great.
All right, that's all I got at the beginning. Happy to take some questions.
Why don't you go ahead and put up that last slide as we wrap up here. That's nice to have your information. Would people be able to contact you for kind of a crib sheet of that information? I know that this is your job. You put a lot of time into things. And would people be able to contact you for like for notes, because there is so much in each stage in comparing the application process to the academic paper?
Yeah, I totally could I don't think anything exists, but I could make one.
Okay.
I'm willing to do that. I've made all this one.
Yeah. Because I don't think that I've not seen something that does this. And I think it's great because it's like, you're first trying to get into college and you're writing at this kind of gate. And then after you're in, then it's a different way of writing.
Hmm.
So, yeah.
Yeah, totally.
Yep. Well, we don't have too many questions from our participants. We have a lot of thank yous. We have a lot of, we've got the question about contacting you, so that's great. I think that we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. We're at a perfect time. You've said pretty much everything that's important. Start early, get other people's information, think about how everything puts together, and your analogy of, that'll stick with me, the analogy of skeletal system, bones, and skin is a really great way to start thinking about this. So,
Great.
all right.
Well, thank you everyone who's here. Sorry I don't get to see your faces, but maybe that'll happen some other time.
Yep.
Great.
All right.
Thank you, Josh.
Yeah.